Welcome to the Catholic History Channel. This is where we talk about important topics to Catholic history and culture and how it affects our world today. Today we'll be looking at an important history, how the Catholic Church has dealt with one particular thing, homosexuality. Let's get in. The Catholic Church's relationship with homosexuality has evolved over the course of 2 millennia, shaped by various cultural, political, and theological factors. Early Christian teachings, influenced by Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions, were primarily focused on sexual morality and the sanctity of marriage. While there is no explicit mention of homosexuality in the Christian Bible, certain passages in the Old Testament, Leviticus, and New Testament, Romans, Corinthians, and Timothy, are often cited for condemning homosexual acts. These texts shaped the Church's attitude towards homosexuality for centuries. In the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church became more proactive in its stance against homosexuality. Influenced by the works of theologians like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who emphasized the natural law theory, the Church viewed homosexual acts as unnatural and sinful. During this time, homosexuality was increasingly criminalized, and those found guilty of engaging in same-sex relationships were often subject to severe punishment, including imprisonment, torture, and execution. The Church's influence over secular authorities played a significant role in the enforcement of these laws. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century challenged many aspects of Catholic doctrine and practice, including the Church's stance on homosexuality. However, the Catholic Church's opposition to homosexuality remained steadfast during the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563, and sought to reaffirm Catholic teachings and address criticisms raised by Protestants, maintained the stance that homosexual acts were a grave sin, though it stopped short of advocating for specific legal penalties. In the 20th century, social and scientific developments began to shift attitudes towards homosexuality. The emergence of the LGBTQ plus rights movement and the growing understanding that homosexuality was a natural variation of human sexuality led to a gradual decrease in societal discrimination. Despite these changes, the Catholic Church maintained its opposition to homosexuality. In 1986, a letter from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, penned by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, reiterated that homosexual acts were intrinsically disordered, quote-unquote, and could not be approved by the Church. In recent years, the Catholic Church has shown signs of a more compassionate approach towards LGBTQ plus individuals. Pope Francis, elected in 2013, has made several statements that appear to signal a shift in tone, if not doctrine. While the Church still officially teaches that homosexual acts are sinful, Pope Francis has emphasized the need for compassion, love, and understanding towards LGBTQ plus individuals. However, the Church's stance remains a contentious issue, with some members calling for a more inclusive approach and others advocating for the preservation of traditional teachings. So let's go into each of these periods in turn. How does the early Church, the earliest Church, draw on other traditions for its position on homosexuality? The early Christian Church's views on homosexuality were significantly influenced by Jewish traditions, as Christianity emerged from the Jewish milieu of the 1st century CE. The Hebrew Bible, which forms the basis of the Old Testament, contains several passages that have been interpreted as condemning homosexual acts, particularly between men. The most well-known of these passages are found in the Book of Leviticus, 18:22 and 20:13, which state that a man should not lie with another man as with a woman, as it is an quote-unquote abomination. These verses formed the basis for the early Church's understanding of homosexuality as sinful, and this belief was further reinforced by the teachings of influential early Christian theologians, such as St. Paul, who drew from Jewish law in his writings. The early Christian Church was also influenced by prevailing attitudes towards homosexuality in the Greco-Roman world. While certain aspects of same-sex relationships were accepted and even celebrated in ancient Greece, particularly the mentorship and erotic relationships between older men and younger male students, known as pederasty, Roman society was more conservative in its views. In the Roman Empire, homosexual acts were not universally condemned, but there were societal expectations around sexual behavior, such as the importance of a man maintaining his masculinity and social status by taking a dominant role in sexual relationships. The early Church mostly absorbed these attitudes, and in an effort to distinguish itself from pagan practices, emphasized the importance of sexual morality and the sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman. In addition to drawing from Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions, the early Christians developed their own teachings on homosexuality through the writings of their theologians and leaders. The Apostle Paul, for example, wrote several epistles that contain passages often interpreted as condemning homosexual acts. In his letter to the Romans, 1:26 to 27, Paul describes men and women who engage in same-sex relationships as committing, quote-unquote, shameful acts and, quote-unquote, unnatural behavior. Similarly, in 1 Corinthians 6:9-10 and 1 Timothy 1:9-10, Paul lists those who engage in homosexual acts among the unrighteous who will not inherit the kingdom of God. These passages became central to the early church's understanding of homosexuality as sinful. Because of the importance of these passages and their relationship to the early church, let's dive into them a little bit and talk about how each of them can be interpreted. So, I mentioned Leviticus 18:22, the Old Testament. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable. This verse, found in the Hebrew Bible, is one of the most frequently cited passages in opposition to homosexuality. It explicitly states that a man should not engage in sexual relations with another man in the same way that he would with a woman. Now, Leviticus 20:13. If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. This verse, also from the Hebrew Bible, not only condemns homosexual acts between men, but prescribes the death penalty for those guilty of engaging in such behavior. Now, moving to the New Testament, Romans 1:26 to 27. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. In this passage, the Apostle Paul characterizes homosexual acts as unnatural and shameful, arguing that those who engage in such behavior are deserving of divine punishment. 1 Corinthians 6:9-10 says, "Or do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who have sex with men, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards, nor slanderers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." Paul in this passage lists various groups of people, including men who have sex with men, as unrighteous and excluded from the kingdom of God. Then finally, 1 Timothy 1:9-10. We also know that the law is made not for the righteous, but for lawbreakers and rebels, the ungodly and sinful, the unholy and irreligious, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, for those practicing homosexuality, for slave traders and liars and perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to the sound doctrine. This verse, also attributed to Paul, again includes those who practice homosexuality among the categories of sinners, who are subject to divine punishment. These Bible verses have been foundational in shaping the early church's relationship with homosexuality and continue to be cited in support of the Catholic Church's opposition to homosexual acts. The early church fathers, including influential figures like Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and John Chrysostom, further developed the church's views on homosexuality. These theologians emphasized the importance of sexual purity, procreation, and the sanctity of marriage, drawing upon both biblical sources and Greco-Roman philosophical traditions. They argued that homosexual acts violated the natural order established by God and were thus inherently sinful. This perspective, rooted in the teachings of the early church fathers, became a cornerstone of the Catholic Church's doctrine on homosexuality and would continue to influence its stance on the issue throughout its history. Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and John Chrysostom were influential early church fathers, and let's go into each one of them in turn. Clement of Alexandria, whose life was from around 150 to 215 CE, was a Christian theologian and philosopher who played a significant role in establishing the foundations of Christian thought in Alexandria, Egypt. In his work, The Instructor, Clement discussed various aspects of Christian morality, including sexual ethics. While he did not explicitly focus on homosexuality, he emphasized the importance of sexual relations being reserved for procreation within the confines of a heterosexual marriage. By promoting this view, Clement indirectly supported the Church's opposition to homosexual acts, which were seen as non-procreative and outside the bounds of traditional marriage. Tertullian, who lived from 155 to 240 CE, was a prolific Christian writer from Carthage in present-day Tunisia. Known as the father of Latin theology, he was the first Christian author to produce an extensive body of literature in Latin. In his writings, Tertullian addressed various moral issues, including sexuality. Like Clement, Tertullian emphasized the importance of sexual relations for procreation within marriage. He also explicitly condemned homosexual acts in his treatise Against the Nations, arguing that such behavior was contrary to nature and divine law. Tertullian's writings on this subject reinforced the early church's opposition to homosexuality and contributed to the development of its doctrine on sexual ethics. Finally, John Chrysostom, born in 349 and died in 407 CE, was the Archbishop of Constantinople and one of the most prominent early church fathers. Known for his eloquence and powerful preaching, Chrysostom addressed a wide range of moral and theological issues in his sermons and writings. In his Homilies on Romans, Chrysostom commented that the Apostle Paul's condemnation of sexual acts in Romans 1:26-27 described homosexual behavior as an extreme form of lust. Chrysostom argued that such acts were not only contrary to nature, but also exhibited a complete disregard for God's design. Chrysostom's interpretation of Paul's writings further entrenched the Church's stance against homosexuality and influenced its teachings for years to come. These early Church Fathers, through their writings and teachings on sexual morality, played a significant role in shaping the Christian Church's opposition to homosexual acts. Their views on the sanctity of marriage, procreation, and the natural order provided a theological basis for the Church's doctrine on homosexuality, which has persisted throughout its history. Now let's move on to the Middle Ages. It's important to know about natural law theology when regarding the Church's stance on homosexuality throughout the Middle Ages. So what is natural law theology? Natural law theology is a philosophical and ethical framework that posits the existence of a moral order inherent in the nature of all things, particularly in human beings. According to this framework, moral principles are derived from the rational observation of nature and the understanding of the purpose and function of different aspects of creation. Natural law theorists argue that these moral principles are universal and can be discovered and understood by all people through the use of reason, independent of divine revelation or specific religious teachings. The concept of natural law theology has its roots in the works of ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Aristotle, who believed that the world has a rational order and that humans could discern this order through the use of reason. This idea was later incorporated into Roman legal theory, which sought to establish a set of universally applicable principles to govern human behavior. During the Middle Ages, natural law theology was further developed and refined by Christian theologians, most notably St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas integrated Aristotle's philosophy with Christian theology, arguing that natural law was an expression of God's eternal law, which governed the universe. According to Aquinas, human beings, as rational creatures, were capable of understanding and adhering to the moral principles embedded in the natural order. In the context of the Church's stance on homosexuality, natural law theology played a significant role in shaping an opposition to homosexuality. Proponents of natural law theory argued that the primary purpose of sexual relations was procreation, and therefore any sexual act that deviated from this purpose, such as homosexuality, was considered unnatural and morally wrong. This perspective, grounded in the natural law tradition, became a key element of the Catholic Church's doctrine on homosexuality throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. So let's go into those major medieval philosophers, St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who were influential theologians who had views on homosexuality informed by natural law theology. Their interpretations of sexuality and morality contributed to the Catholic Church's stance on homosexuality, emphasizing the importance of procreation and the idea that homosexual acts are unnatural and morally wrong. So Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 CE, was a prominent Christian theologian and philosopher whose writings had a profound impact on the development of Western Christianity. In his works, Augustine argued that the primary purpose of sex was procreation, and any sexual act that deviated from this purpose was sinful. He viewed sexual desire itself as a consequence of original sin, which distorted human nature and led to disordered passions. While Augustine did not specifically focus on homosexuality, his views on sexual morality laid the groundwork for the Church's opposition to homosexual acts. By asserting that the primary purpose of sex was procreation, Augustine's teachings implicitly condemned non-procreative sexual acts, including homosexual behavior, as contrary to natural law. St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived almost a millennia later, 1225 to 1274 CE, was a Dominican friar and a central figure in scholasticism, an intellectual movement that sought to synthesize Christian theology with the philosophy of Aristotle. In his seminal work Summa Theologica, Aquinas discussed the concept of natural law extensively, arguing that it was an expression of God's eternal law, and that human beings could discern the moral principles embedded in the natural order through reason. Drawing on Augustine's ideas about sexuality and procreation, Aquinas explicitly condemned homosexual acts as contrary to natural law. He reasoned that since the primary purpose of sexual activity was procreation, any sexual acts that could not fulfill this purpose were, again, unnatural and morally wrong. As a result, Aquinas classified homosexual acts as a kind of sodomy and considered them to be against nature. Both Augustine and Aquinas, through their teachings on procreation and natural law theology, contributed to the Catholic Church's understanding of homosexuality as unnatural and morally wrong. Their emphasis on the procreative purpose of sexual relations and the moral principles derived from the natural order provided a theological foundation for the Church's opposition to homosexual acts throughout its history. Now, medieval culture itself, as far as it concerned homosexuality, was rather complex and varied, reflecting the diverse range of attitudes and practices across different regions, social classes, and religious communities. Although it's difficult to generalize about the entire medieval period, which spanned from the 5th to 15th centuries, several key aspects can be identified that characterize the medieval approach to homosexuality. First off, in terms of legal and religious condemnation, as we've just talked about, medieval society was deeply influenced by Christianity, and the Catholic Church's teachings on sexual morality had a significant impact on the attitudes and practices of the time. Homosexual acts, as we've just talked about, were generally considered sinful and unnatural based on these biblical interpretations and natural law theology. Consequently, many secular legal codes influenced by the Church, such as those in England and France and the Holy Roman Empire, criminalized sodomy, which encompassed various non-procreative acts, including homosexual behavior. Punishment for those found guilty of sodomy ranged from public humiliation and fines to imprisonment, exile, or even death. Beyond that, however, there were social stigmas and silences. The condemnation of homosexual acts by both religious and secular authorities contributed to a culture of silence and shame surrounding homosexuality. In general, medieval society placed a strong emphasis on the traditional roles of men and women in marriage and family life, and those who engaged in homosexual relationships often faced social stigma and ostracism. As a result, evidence of homosexuality in the medieval period is often fragmented, hidden, or coded, making it challenging for historians to accurately reconstruct the experiences of LGBTQ individuals during this time. But what about in art and literature? Despite the societal condemnation of homosexuality, there are instances of same-sex love and desire depicted in medieval art and literature. Some examples include the passionate friendships depicted in the poems of French troubadours, the homoerotic imagery found in illuminated manuscripts, and the stories of same-sex relationships in the Arabian Nights. These depictions suggest that, while homosexuality was generally disapproved of, it was still acknowledged and in some cases celebrated in the artistic and literary expressions of the time. What about monastic life? Monastic communities, with their single-sex living arrangements, provided an environment in which same-sex relationships and homoeroticism could actually develop. While the Church strictly enforced rules of celibacy and chastity, there is historical evidence of romantic and sexual relationships between monks and nuns, among them as well. Some of the most famous examples include the love letters between the 12th century nun Heloise and the philosopher Peter Abelard, proving that romance could potentially spring up within these convents. But there's also the homoerotic poetry of the monk Marbod of Rennes. In conclusion, medieval culture concerning homosexuality was characterized by a complex interplay of religious condemnation, legal restrictions, social stigma, and artistic expression. Although homosexual acts were generally viewed as sinful and unnatural, there were instances of same-sex love and desire that managed to persist in various forms throughout medievalism. So now let's move on to the Reformation period. The Protestant Reformation was a religious, political, and cultural movement that began in the early 16th century, which led to the creation of Protestant churches and significantly altered the landscape of Christianity in Europe. The movement was initiated by the German monk Martin Luther, who criticized the Catholic Church's teachings and practices, particularly the selling of indulgences, which were documents that claimed to reduce the punishment for sins in the afterlife. Luther's publication of the 95 Theses in 1517 sparked widespread debate and ultimately led to a schism within the Church. The Reformation saw the emergence of various Protestant denominations, such as the Lutheran, the Calvinist, and Anglican, each with their own distinctive beliefs and practices. These new denominations rejected the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church, emphasizing the importance of the Bible as the sole source of divine revelation and the doctrine of salvation through faith alone. In response to the challenges posed by the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church initiated the Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Reformation, which aimed to address the criticisms leveled against the Church, reform its internal structures and practices, and reassert its authority. The Counter-Reformation saw the establishment of new religious orders, such as the Jesuits, increased missionary activity, and the development of new forms of religious art and architecture. One of the central events of the Counter-Reformation was the Council of Trent, which took place between 1545 and 1563. The council was a series of meetings held by high-ranking Catholic officials with the purpose of defining church doctrine, addressing issues of corruption, and responding to the challenges posed by Protestantism. Regarding homosexuality, the Council of Trent did not actually issue any specific rulings or canons, but it did reaffirm the Catholic Church's teachings on sexual morality and the importance of upholding traditional marriage. The Council's rulings on marriage and celibacy reinforced the Church's traditional condemnation of homosexual acts. The Council's reaffirmation of the Church's stance on sexual ethics helped solidify these teachings as central tenets of Catholic doctrine, which persisted long after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation period. Now, what about the surrounding era, right? During the early modern period, which roughly spanned from this late 15th century to the late 18th century, homosexual culture varied across different regions, social classes, and religious contexts. Although generalizing about this diverse period is again challenging, several key aspects can be identified. In many parts of Europe, homosexual acts continued to be criminalized under secular law. Punishments still range from fines and imprisonment to corporal punishment and execution. Religious authorities, both Protestant and Catholic, also condemned homosexuality as sinful and unnatural, reinforcing the societal disapproval of same-sex relationships. But despite the legal and religious restrictions, homosexual subcultures began to emerge in some urban centers during the early modern period. Cities like Amsterdam, London, and Paris became known for their relatively tolerant attitudes towards homosexuality and provided spaces for LGBTQ individuals to socialize, form relationships, and develop networks of support. These subcultures often revolved around particular establishments like taverns, coffee houses, or theaters, where individuals could meet and engage in same-sex relationships with relative discretion. The growing visibility of homosexual subcultures during the early modern period led to increased efforts by authorities to suppress and persecute LGBTQ individuals. A notable example of this is the Molly House raids in 18th century England, during which establishments catering to gay men were targeted by law enforcement, leading to the arrest and punishment of those involved. Similar crackdowns occurred in other European cities, reflecting the broader societal anxiety surrounding homosexuality and efforts to maintain traditional moral and sexual norms. The early modern period saw the emergence of numerous literary and artistic works that dealt with themes of same-sex love and desire, both explicitly and implicitly. Writers like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and John Donne explored homoerotic themes in their plays and their poetry, while artists like Caravaggio and Michelangelo incorporated homoerotic imagery into their works. These expressions of same-sex love served to challenge prevailing social norms and provided a means for LGBTQ individuals to express their identities. Thus, homosexual culture, during the early modern period, was marked by a complex interplay of legal and religious condemnation, the emergence of subcultures in urban centers, increased visibility and persecution, and the artistic expression of same-sex love. Okay, so let's move on, finally, to the century that we've just gone through. What has the Church's view on homosexuality been throughout the 20th century? Throughout the 20th century, the Catholic Church maintained its traditional stance on homosexuality, but its approach to addressing homosexuality has evolved over time to reflect broader social, cultural, and theological shifts. Several key developments characterized their engagement with homosexuality during this period. So first off, there was a distinction between orientation and behavior. In the mid-20th century, the Church began to differentiate between homosexual orientation and homosexual behavior. While it continued to condemn homosexual acts, it acknowledged that homosexual orientation was not in itself sinful, as it was often viewed as an involuntary condition. This distinction was formally articulated in official church documents such as the 1975 Declaration on Certain Questions Concerning Sexual Ethics and the 1986 Letter to the Bishops of the Catholic Church on the Pastoral Care of Homosexual Persons. Alongside the distinction between orientation and behavior, the Church began to emphasize the importance of providing pastoral care and compassion to individuals expressing or experiencing same-sex attraction. That 1986 letter to the bishops called for the pastoral support of homosexual persons, urging the clergy to help them lead chaste lives in accordance with church teachings. This approach represented a shift from a solely condemnatory stance towards a more compassionate and supportive attitude. During the latter half of the 20th century, the church increasingly spoke out against unjust discrimination towards LGBTQ individuals. They opposed discriminatory practices in areas like employment, housing, and access to public services, arguing that all people, regardless of their sexual orientation, deserved respect and dignity. However, the church maintained its opposition to same-sex marriage and the normalization of homosexual behavior. Finally, the AIDS crisis in the 1980s and 1990s prompted the church to engage more directly with the gay community, as it provided care and support to those affected by the disease. Many Catholic organizations and individuals played a vital role in offering healthcare, counseling, and advocacy for people living with HIV/AIDS. However, the church's opposition to the use of condoms as a means of preventing the transmission of HIV/AIDS drew criticism from public health advocates and LGBTQ activists. So, one important document here is the 1986 letter to the bishops. So how did it come about? Who was it affecting? What kind of controversies did it cause? The 1986 letter to the bishops of the Catholic Church on the pastoral care of homosexual persons, also known as the Letter on the Pastoral Care of Homosexual Persons, was a document issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, CDF, which is the Vatican office responsible for promoting and defending Catholic doctrine. The letter was signed by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would then become Pope Benedict XVI. The letter was intended to provide guidance to Catholic bishops and other leaders on how to provide pastoral care to people who identified as homosexual. The letter acknowledged that homosexuals have been and are the object of violent malice in speech or in action, and called on Catholics to treat homosexuals with compassion and sensitivity. However, the letter also reaffirms the Catholic Church's teaching that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered and contrary to the natural law. The letter caused controversy and criticism among many LGBT activists and their supporters, who saw it as reinforcing negative stereotypes and promoting discrimination against homosexuals. Some critics also accused the letter of using language that was ambiguous and open to misinterpretation. However, the 1986 letter on the pastoral care of homosexual persons remains an important part of Catholic Church doctrine on homosexuality. It has never been officially revised or rescinded, although it has been supplemented by subsequent Vatican documents, including the 1992 Catechism and the 2003 Considerations regarding proposals to give legal recognition to unions between homosexual persons. So, as a final thing to do in this video, let's go over the last three popes and compare their attitudes towards homosexuality. Pope John Paul II, who served as pope from 1978 until 2005, had a rather complex and nuanced view. Although he affirmed the Catholic Church's traditional teachings that homosexual acts are morally wrong and contrary to the natural law, a position that he expressed in various Vatican documents issued during his pontificate, including, of course, that 1986 letter to the bishops and the 1992 Catechism. He, however, emphasized the dignity and worth of all human beings, including those who identified as homosexual. He spoke out against discrimination and violence and encouraged Catholics to show compassion and understanding towards them. In a 1985 speech to the Pontifical Council for the Family, he stated that, quote-unquote, every person, regardless of his or her sexual orientation, ought to be respected in his or her dignity and treated with consideration. John Paul II also had personal relationships with several people who identified as homosexual, including his longtime friend and collaborator, philosopher Anna Teresa Timinica. While the nature of their relationship has been the subject of some debate, John Paul II's letters to Timinica suggest a deep emotional connection between them. So, his view of homosexuality can be characterized as one that emphasized the importance of upholding Catholic teaching, while also emphasizing the need for respect, compassion, and understanding towards those who identify as homosexual. As Pope Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger maintained the Catholic Church's traditional teaching on homosexuality, which holds that homosexual acts are quote-unquote intrinsically disordered. He reinforced this position in his role as prefect of the CDF, that Vatican office responsible for promoting and defending Catholic doctrine. He was a very scholarly and academic pope. During his pontificate, there were other various Vatican documents that upheld that doctrine. However, Benedict XVI also emphasized the dignity and worth of all human beings, including those who identify as homosexuality. He called on Catholics to show compassion and respect towards them. For instance, in his 2010 book, Light of the World, Benedict XVI stated that, quote-unquote, people with homosexual tendencies must be treated with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Benedict XVI made headlines in 2013 when he, of course, became the first pope in centuries to resign from his position, citing his health. Following his resignation, he has continued to be an influential figure in the Catholic Church, although he has largely avoided making public statements on controversial issues like homosexuality. Pope Francis, of course, has taken a more progressive and inclusive stance towards homosexuality compared to his predecessors. He has repeatedly emphasized the importance of treating LGBT individuals with respect and compassion, and has made several public statements advocating for the protection of their rights. And famously, in a 2013 interview with journalists on a flight back from Brazil, Francis asked, "Who am I to judge?" when he was asked about gay priests. He also criticized the Church's focus on issues like abortion, contraception, and homosexuality, stating that the Church should instead focus on promoting social justice and serving the poor. He has also made several gestures towards the LGBT community, such as meeting with openly gay couples and washing the feet of a group of young inmates, including 2 Muslims and 2 self-identified homosexuals, during a Holy Thursday service in 2013. However, while Francis's more accepting approach to homosexuality has been welcomed by many, some critics argue that the Church's teaching on the immorality of homosexual acts has not changed, and that Francis's statements and actions do not constitute a substantive shift in Church doctrine. Nonetheless, Francis's more compassionate and inclusive rhetoric has been seen as a positive step towards greater acceptance of LGBT individuals within the Catholic Church. Thank you for listening. If you liked this video and want to hear more of it, please subscribe to this channel.